How's it going, everyone? Hope you're doing well. So as of Wednesday the 2nd, we've seen all the cards in Modern Horizons 2, and I don't think it's any kind of hot take to say that this set is fucking ridiculous. So this is going to be a huge set, obviously, for Modern, Legacy, as well as Commander to some degree. But more importantly, there are so many great cube cards here. So much so that there was no way I was going to be able to do a top 10 or even really like a top 20 for this set. So I'm just going to go through today and look at some of the more notable cards and give my opinions on those. So I think the thing that has sparked the most discussion around the set are the new evoke creatures. If you aren't familiar, the 5 cards in this cycle you can cast and then sacrifice them as soon as they enter the battlefield, and they do their thing, and you can do this without paying their mana cost by exiling a card of the same color from your hand. So Solitude is a card that does this. It's a Swords to Plowshares for 5 attached to a 3/2 flash flyer with lifelink. I think this is one of the stronger cards in this cycle, and in most higher level cubes, I can see the argument for like 2 for 1ing yourself for essentially a 1 mana spell isn't great on rate. And I agree with that most of the time. Even hard casting this I think is super powerful though. And I do think there are going to be those niche situations where you are going to want to play this for free. Say you tap out the turn before and your opponent is just going to kill you with something. It still doesn't feel great to 2 for 1 yourself, but it's better than being dead. I think that's kind of how most people feel about these cards right now. I don't think it's any different in Cube. But yeah, casting it for 5 for the 3/2 flyer with lifelink honestly is also really good. I think this is going to see play a lot. So next up, we're looking at Subtlety. Subtlety is a 4 mana 3/3 flyer with flash as well, that puts a creature or planeswalker spell on either the top or bottom of its controller's library. I think this is really good, especially in cubes that have a lot of creatures that once they hit the board, they're hard to answer. And I do think you'll be fine going down a card to stop an opponent from like channeling a Blightsteel or something similar into play on turn 2. And the flying body isn't a bad rate at all either. So next up, we have probably the most powerful card from this cycle, Grief. Grief's a 4 mana 3/2 with Menace that thought seizes your opponent on entry. And while paying the evoke cost for this is effectively trading 2 cards for 1, combining this with cards like Ephemerate, you can more than make up for it on turn 1 or 2. I really love this card, and I think it is a better unmask in pretty much every cube. I also cannot wait to live the Ephemerate dream with this and just rip your opponent's hand apart on like turn 1 or 2. So the red creature in the cycle, Fury, while probably being the most underwhelming in the cycle, I feel like has a place in a lot of cubes still, being a 5 mana 3/3 double striker and dealing 4 damage divided between any number of creatures or planeswalkers. So in the right matchup, like versus mono white for example, I can definitely see a world where this is evoked and trades for 3, maybe even 4 creatures, which is probably not likely to happen a lot, but it does have a super high ceiling nonetheless. And even casting this for 5, killing a planeswalker and swinging for 6 every turn is a super good way to win a game. And bringing up the rear for this cycle is the green part, obviously, which is Endurance. Endurance is a 3 mana 3/4 with flash that dumps a player's graveyard to the bottom of their library. So this is definitely a great foil to Reanimator or Dredge decks to stop an opponent from going off early. But also if your cube has a mill archetype, it can be a really good way to thicken your deck back up. Overall, I like this a lot, and I really don't think any cards from this cycle are just like outright bad. I think this and Fury are probably the most narrow two, but I definitely think they have a home somewhere. So one of my absolute favorite cards from this set is Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. Karizev's cute monkey friend got a non-token card, and I fucking love it. So we have a 1 mana 2/1 with dash for 2 that not only creates a treasure when it deals damage to an opponent, it exiles the top of their library and lets you cast it that turn. So this actually might be one of the best 1-drops they've ever printed. It's super efficient, it ramps, it's card advantage, it's insane. I think this should be an auto include in pretty much any cube that currently runs like Zurgo or Robber of the Rich. Probably a good replacement for Zurgo, honestly. Another card I'm really excited about specifically for cube is Ignoble Hierarch. They gave Jund Noble Hierarch. That's it. That's the card. It's super cool. I love color shifted cards, and this is kind of a fun take on that. It is a color shifted version essentially of the best mana dork ever printed. I think obviously this replaces like Elves of Deep Shadow in most cubes, or if your cube needs an additional mana dork, here's a pretty great one. So another thing that has garnered a lot of attention are the new Suspend cards, and I think some of them definitely have a place in cubes, while others might be a little bit too slow. For example, Profane Tutor is probably what I've seen the most hype about, and I think in Commander it definitely has a home in a lot of decks. However, for Cube, I think this is probably a little too slow unless you don't currently own like Demonic Tutor or Vampiric Tutor, either for budget or power concerns. And if that's the case, this could be a really great alternative for you. However, I do think this just isn't going to be very good in Cube. So Inevitable Betrayal is Bribery with Suspend 3 for 3 mana, which is definitely powerful and definitely worse than Bribery. However, I just don't find effects like this very fun in Cube. It's either an I win button against a deck with Eldrazi Titans, or it's a dead card against like a Storm deck that doesn't have a lot of creatures. So obviously ignoring Suspend, this card is really good. If this is the kind of strategy you like to support in your cube, again, I think you probably just want Bribery here. And probably the weirdest Suspend card out of this cycle is Gaia's Will, which really caught me off guard. It's basically Yawgmoth's Will in green that suspends for 4 turns. So there were a lot of weird green cards in the set, and this definitely takes the cake for me. It makes sense for green to have this. It fits the color thematically. It just feels so weird for green to get all these like obvious Storm cards. I'm not sure if this is an amazing Storm card in Cube, but I'm definitely going to try it out and see how it goes. I think it definitely gives more incentive for Storm decks to play like Heartbeat of Spring and possibly just like entire new Storm archetypes in general. I don't think this is necessarily as powerful as going off with like Mind's Desire, Tendrils, Brainstorm, or anything like that. But even like the new like Squirrel Storm card could definitely be really fun to play in Cube if you're like tired of losing to Tendrils all the time. And the last Suspend card I wanted to talk about is Soul Talisman, which is Soul Ring with Suspend for 3. So obviously a strictly worse version of the best card in Vintage Cube. I think at a glance, this is just bad. And in a lot of decks, it's probably just going to be bad. But Lotus Bloom is pretty much the same thing. Sub Black Lotus for Soul Ring, obviously, which definitely has a place in a lot of ramp strategies in most cubes. So I'm not sure this is going to be as bad as people are making it seem. Also, of course, if your cube has ways to take advantage of Suspend cards, all of these get a lot better. So like Goblin Dark Dwellers, you can recast these from the graveyard without suspending them. You can cast them like off of As Foretold or anything with Cascade. So I think most of these cards do have homes in some cubes out there, but Suspend definitely can be kind of clunky in a lot of cubes. So in this set, we also got a non-legendary Reanimator suite, which is really interesting. I think for Modern, this is really great. However, I think most cubes in general are just going to prefer like Entomb and Reanimate over Persist and Unmarked Grave. This can hit Grave Titan or like new cards like Sarah's Emissary that are, you know, really good. But regardless of power level, you're likely still going to want to reanimate legendary creatures. And there's really no shortage on cards that already do that. So I think this could definitely be a fun archetype, especially on like a more budget friendly cube. But it definitely, a lot of these cards do seem like strictly worse versions of things we already have. So we did get a really great double black removal spell with Damn that can also be overloaded for 2 and 2 white, effectively making this Wrath of God and like Murder in one card. So I think this is like a pretty clear upgrade in most cubes to one of the two. I really like the design of this card. It's super clean. It's super efficient. This is probably going to replace Wrath of God in my cube. And another double black spell that a lot of people have been freaking out about is Dauthi Voidwalker, which is a 2 mana 3/2 with Shadow, which is already pretty great. But it also reads, if a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, instead exile it with a void counter on it. You can then tap and sacrifice it to put one of those exiled cards into play without paying its mana cost. So this is ridiculous in a mill deck. It's really good in any deck with heavy hand disruption, and it just does so much for 2 mana. I don't have anything else to say. This card is just really good. Another card that's garnered a lot of hype over the past few weeks is Esper Sentinel, and reasonably so. So this is a 1 mana 1/1 in white that draws a card when your opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, unless they pay colorless equal to Esper Sentinel's power. So obviously this is an EDH All-Star. I think this is great in Cube too. Throw a Batterskull on this or get some Anthems in play, and the taxing effect on this gets so much better. But even without that, just as a 1/1, when most decks are playing on curve, this is going to be a great mono white card almost all of the time, especially if you can get it out on turn 1. I see this drawing a ton of cards. I know it's been said a million times, but it's white Rhystic Study. It's great. So we've gotten a lot of cards that call back to older cards, and Timeless Witness is one of the better ones in my opinion. For just 1 mana more, we get pretty much an Eternal Witness, which is never an ability I'll complain about having redundancy with. Only with Timeless Witness, we can also eternalize it for 7 to get a second card back from this, as well as a 4/4 body. So I like this card, and I've been really hoping to get more regrowth effects for my cube, and this is a more than welcome addition. So next up, I do want to talk about Cauldron Complete. Now, this has been a controversial one. It's a 7 mana equipment with Living Weapon, which means it comes attached to a 0/0 Germ token, and it grants +5/+5, first strike, trample, indestructible, haste, and whenever it deals damage to a creature, you exile it. So this does a lot. However, 7 mana is a hell of an investment to give an opponent an Ancient Grudge target. However, I do think, particularly like in my cube, or even like cubes that are kind of built around the Magic Online Vintage cube, they really need at least one more good Stoneforge target to really make Stoneforge consistent enough to really like warrant its inclusion in most decks. And I think being able to Stoneforge on turn 1 or 2 and drop this on turn 2 or 3 could be really insane. And in a deck with a lot of fast mana, I wouldn't mind playing this on its own or just hard casting it. I mean, look at like Mere Battlesphere. It's also 7 mana. It's also really good. I don't know if this is Mere Battlesphere good, but I think it's definitely worth testing out. I'm excited about this card. So next up is a card I definitely don't think belongs in every cube, but I do think the design is really neat and I wanted to bring it up. Flame Blitz is a 1 mana red enchantment that deals 5 damage to each planeswalker at the end of your end step, and it also has cycling for 2, so it's never dead. So if you have a cube that has a high number of planeswalkers in it, and maybe not a lot of ways for colors like red and green to directly answer them, this could be a really great consideration for you. I do think it might be a little bit narrow for a lot of cubes, but I definitely think someone out there needs an effect like this. So this next one is probably not going to be something that sees a ton of cube play because there aren't a ton of mill archetypes in cubes that I've seen at least, but it's a pet strategy and this card is ridiculous. And that is Fractured Sanity. For 3 blue mana, target opponent mills 14, and you can cycle it to make your opponent mill 4 instead. So if you do nothing all game but cast this on turn 3 or 4, and then Snapcaster and recast this on turn 5, that's already enough mill to win in limited with no other cards being cast. This is ridiculous. I understand why a lot of people don't support mill in cube, but I do love this card, and I'm definitely gonna at least test it out. So I think for me personally, this was one of the most unexpected designs from this set, and that is Yavimaya Cradle of Growth, which is just a green Urborg, making all of your other lands forest in addition to other types. I don't think this card is like busted, but I definitely think it's really powerful, similar to Urborg obviously. And it makes playing multicolored, especially like high green Devotion, which there's no shortage of, a lot easier. So we got a few planeswalkers in this set, and honestly the only one that really stood out to me as like a possibility for cube, and I'm honestly still not 100% how I feel about this, but it's gonna be Grist, which is a 3 mana Golgari Walker with 3 loyalty, but it's also a creature when it's not in the battlefield, which is really cool. So this could be reanimated if you wanted to. This could be put into play off of Birthing Pod or Collected Company, and that is really neat. The +1 makes a 1/1 insect and mills a card. If it happens to mill an insect, you repeat that process. The -2 synergizes well with the plus ability and lets you sacrifice a creature to destroy target creature or planeswalker. And the -5 has each opponent lose life equal to the number of creatures in your graveyard. So it's definitely no Oko, but I think that's a good thing. And I'm really excited to try this out. I think in more of like a modern power level cube, where there's a lot of like mid-range like creature archetypes built in, this is going to be really powerful there. So next up, we've got Turok Dread Cancer of Hymn to Turok fame. So this is really neat. Turok is a 2 mana 2/1 with a kicker cost that is the same as him. And if you pay it, you get that effect when he enters the battlefield, which is an opponent discarding 2 cards at random. He also gets a +1/+1 counter whenever an opponent discards a card, and has protection from white. So I like this card a lot in cube, especially in cubes where the central theme for black is kind of like a Staxy discard based strategy. I think this also falls under the not broken but really good category most of the time. So another really interesting callback is Tireless Provisioner, clearly in like the art and name being a reference to Tireless Tracker, although this really acts as kind of a mix of Tireless Tracker and Lotus Cobra. The Provisioner is a green 3 mana 3/2 that creates either a food or treasure token when a land enters play under your control. I love this card. It plays like Lotus Cobra with fetches, with the benefit of being able to keep that mana to ramp into bigger things your next few turns. The design is really clean, really straightforward. I think this is a really good just green 3-drop. So next up, we're looking at one of, if not the very first card to actually be spoiled from the set, which is Urza's Saga, paying homage to, well, Urza's Saga. This is an enchantment land, which I did not actually realize at first. The card is obviously a saga, meaning it goes through 3 phases over 3 turns and then it dies, which might not sound worth running on a land, but I think the value you get from this card just being a land is kind of insane. And it just gets better with like Crucible of Worlds and ways to recur it. So the first turn, the land gives you the ability to tap for colorless, which is good. We usually want lands to make mana. And if I'm understanding this correctly, the land retains that ability on the next 2 turns as well. Don't quote me on that though. On turn 2, you can pay 2 and tap it to create a 0/0 construct token, known as Constructs. Very cute. They get +1/+1 for each artifact you control. And on turn 3, you can search your library for an artifact with mana cost 1 or 0 and put it into play. So really, I think this is the most viable in powered cubes. Ideally, you play this, turn 2, make a guy, turn 3, find either Soul Ring, a Lotus, a Mox, pump up your construct in the process, which is a ton of value for a card that costs no mana to play. I really love this card. I think this is ridiculous. Obviously, again, I don't think this is going to be like you play this and just win the game, but the amount of value that this land generates is just so insane to me. I'm probably overvaluing this a lot, but I love it. You can fight me about it. And the last uncommon we're gonna be looking at today is Sudden Edict, being kind of a mix between Sudden Spoiling and Chainer's Edict. So this is a 2 mana black instant with split second, so it can't be responded to, meaning it can't be countered. And it makes your opponent sacrifice a creature. So I don't think this is like an auto include by any stretch, but it's definitely a pretty good upgrade to Chainer's Edict most of the time, I think, especially if you're building like a peasant cube. And the last card I want to bring up is actually something that I wrote off entirely at first glance, and that is Sword of Hearth and Home. I'm really not a fan of the swords in vintage cubes specifically. I think they're fun in modern and legacy, but this card is actually pretty cool, and I do think a lot of cubes could really make use of this. So this is the green white sword, meaning the equipped creature has protection from those 2 colors and gets +2/+2. When that creature deals damage to a player, you can blink a creature you control and also search your library for a basic land and put it into play. So this is really cool for landfall decks. Obviously, this is cool in decks that have a lot of creatures that do things when they enter the battlefield. This pairs great with most of the evoke creatures from this set, which is also really cool. Obviously, this is no Jite, but I really do think this is one of the better swords in most cases. So I know there's a ton of cards I left out. I know this is a super long video. I was trying to be as brief as possible to get through as much as possible. There's really just too much for me to comment on with this set. Let me know in the comments what your favorite cards from this set are. What reprints are you most excited about? So I am going to try to be more active on this channel going forward. In addition to all like the top 10 stuff that's pretty quick to make, I have been doing a lot of work for like longer format videos as well, and kind of jumping into like different styled videos. So if that's something you're interested in, be sure to subscribe. And yeah, thanks so much for watching.